Today, we turn our attention to Afghanistan. President Biden surprised our allies and even probably some of his closest advisors by accelerating the withdrawal of U.S. troops a few months ago. The closing of Bagram Air Base on July 5th precipitated an avalanche which led to, frankly, the demise of the Afghan government. With the presidential compound overtaken by the Taliban, President Ashraf Ghani fled to the United Arab Emirates in mid-August, in fact on August 16th. While a massive airlift has successfully rescued over 90,000 refugees, there will be many thousands more who are left behind to face an uncertain future. In today's program, we'll be asking some questions. Why did we originally go into Afghanistan? Did the mission change? What went right? What went wrong? And now, what are our options? To discuss this and much more, I'm joined by Ambassador Ryan Crocker. He's a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who was ambassador in 6 countries, tough countries: Lebanon, Kuwait, Syria, Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In fact, shortly after 9/11 in January of 2002, he reopened our embassy in the capital, Kabul. Then he came back as ambassador in 2011 and worked for over a year. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and he, along with General David Petraeus, are on the advisory board of a very important and interesting organization that we'll be talking about. No One Left Behind. Ambassador Crocker, thanks so much for being with us today on our McQuestion program.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
So let's start with this question. Why did we originally go into Afghanistan now some 20 years ago, and who was the enemy?
Afghanistan, unlike Iraq, had a clear and definite purpose of our military intervention that remained the same purpose throughout the next 2 decades, and that was the response to 9/11. 9/11 came to us out of Afghanistan, the al-Qaeda leadership under the security umbrella of the Taliban. They had relocated from East Africa to Afghanistan in the mid-90s after the Taliban took control of the country. That's why we went in, to ensure that al-Qaeda never again had a safe location in Afghanistan to plan the next 9/11. It was, again, clear in my mind when I went in just after New Year's Day in 2002 to officially open the embassy. A few months later, March 11th, 6 months after 9/11, we placed a piece of the World Trade Center at the base of our flagpole at the embassy. We had a Marine company there. They were providing security, all of the civilians. Absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind that day why we were there.
But did the mission change? Because
the mission
we
never
hear about nation building.
The mission never changed. That was the purpose. Now, what did change and shift and move back and forth were the means to that end. How best to ensure that al-Qaeda never comes back, never has another shot at us from Afghanistan. And again, so nation building was not the end. Some forms of it were seen as the means to the end. But the end was, again, America's national security.
So what are our successes when you look back prior to this withdrawal? If someone had talked with you, say, 6 months ago, a year ago, where did we succeed and where have we failed?
We had really succeeded at a number of levels. When I left Afghanistan in 2012, we were pretty much at the peak of the Afghan troop surge that President Obama had authorized in 2009, meaning we had close to 100,000 U.S. troops on the ground in Afghanistan. The Taliban was there. We took casualties, a lot of casualties. The fight was still going on, but the Taliban controlled 0 of Afghanistan's 34 provincial capitals. over time, we were able to reduce that force so that when President Obama left office, we had a little bit more than 10,000 troops on the ground, a tenth of what was there when I was there. And the Taliban still didn't hold a single provincial capital. With President Trump, numbers continued to decline to 5,000 and then abruptly to 2,500. And the Taliban still didn't hold a single provincial capital. So in terms of keeping the Taliban out of power and out of a position of control over Afghan territory, we were doing it with a progressively smaller force, but still able to ensure the Taliban did not give the upper hand. It was a status quo, frankly, I think that could have continued for years.
But is that a status quo that we would have had to maintain as long as we've been in Europe or Korea? Would we just have been there? As I remember once Nick Burns said, Ambassador Nick Burns, we have a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage. Well, that was a long time when he said that, and we were already in there 20 years.
Yeah, so it's a question I've never really understood terribly well. I don't think the American people were all wrapped up in the very small force that we had in Afghanistan until President Biden decided to pull them all out. I just don't think it was an issue. And in Korea, for example, it's not an issue there either, where we have 28,000 troops. And of course, many more than that in Western Europe. They've been there since after World War II. So frankly, I just don't understand the logic. 30-year mortgage, that's good. I tended to put it as an insurance policy. That as we steadied out, the amount of money we were spending, still considerable, I think was indefinitely sustainable for us. And again, a pretty inexpensive premium against another 9/11.
From one thing that I feel that perhaps our viewers, and I know that I didn't appreciate this for a while, is that our 2,500 troops were really a quarter of what was there, and we had great support from our NATO allies. I assume they've all left along, or planning to leave along with us.
Yeah, again, this is a kind of a multiple effect disaster. You're right. NATO did have significantly more forces in Afghanistan than we did at the end. And throughout these 20 years, it was a popular mission in NATO. The NATO countries liked it. They learned a lot about interoperability, which is very important for a coalition force. They were great supporters of it. So again, how ironic that after the decision of President Trump abruptly to cut the force from 5,000 to 2,500, which elicited a very negative NATO reaction, the fact that they weren't consulted, President Biden then did the same thing, except with far more significant consequences. There was no consultation with NATO on the full withdrawal, and they had to respond very quickly to do something they absolutely did not want to do, which is get their own forces out.
And we have to remember that this is the first time that Article 5 in the NATO Charter was ever applied, invoked. Right.
And I find myself kind of saying to myself, well, yeah, Trump did that. Not really a surprise. But boy, it sure was a surprise when President Biden then doubled down on the Trump strategic error. And we have a bunch of really unhappy allies, as again, I think we saw at the beginning of the week with the G7 virtual meeting.
And we certainly created a lot of question marks with our special relationship with the UK. Ambassador, you had a piece that was published, a guest column in the New York Times, I think it was on August 21st, and you talked about strategic patience. What did you mean?
Strategic patience is patience directed at or devoted to a strategy a strategic objective. We tend to be an impatient people, and as Americans, and I get that. America wasn't built on patience. Get her done, get after it, get the railroads through, build the highways, open the markets. That's how we operated. The downside of that impatience, though, is in the international sphere. We have been a world leader since the end of World War II, but we still like our commitments and our initiatives to move quickly to a satisfactory end, and then we move on to something else. We don't, as a nation, deal terribly well with the color of gray. We like it black, we like it white. We want to know, we want to have a definite timeline, definite this, definite that. And the world sadly doesn't work that way, particularly in the greater Middle East. So over time, our allies have seen our impatience cause us to walk away from really tough problems or problems that don't have a clear, crisp solution. Our adversaries have come to count on that impatience. And I mentioned in the piece I did for the New York Times, this phrase that has been out there for years, attributed to the Taliban, saying, you Americans have the watches, but we have the time. And that is exactly what we've seen now, vindicating the tenacity of the Taliban. They outlasted us.
Now, I know where you stand. You think we should have maintained our troops there and other NATO troops. But let me be a devil's advocate. If we were going to withdraw, how could we have done it not to create this fiasco that's happened the last few weeks?
Well, that's what I was alluding to earlier. We had, in my view, a very bad mistake by President Biden at the strategic level. But as you say, that given that that decision, could it have played out differently? Well, it would be hard to imagine it playing out any worse than it has. The mass panic that ensued with President Biden's decision, the quick collapse of Afghan national security forces, the surge of the Taliban, and in a matter of just a few days, the Taliban went from less than a week holding basically no provincial capitals to holding all of them. We've been treated to the awful spectacle. If you remember the C-17 Air Force cargo plane making a slow taxi at Kabul airport, mobbed by desperate Afghans, several of whom clung to the wheel wells at takeoff and later dropped to their death. The strategic failure I've tried to describe, this was an immense tactical failure, that we could not organize a coordinated, multifaceted, safe extraction, not only of our folks, but the folks that have helped us. And in the final days of this evacuation, there are going to be thousands of individuals who need to get out, who should get out, but won't get out. And really, sadly, that's going to include American citizens. So
let me ask you this, and again, allow me to push back. Those who don't agree with you will say that the Afghan military force immediately just gave up their arms and surrendered. And secondly, there's such rampant corruption, some caused by U.S. vendors and others, but certainly within the Afghan government. How would you respond to those two, serious criticisms of what has happened?
When I was there, when you visited, Jim, every week there would be a ceremony at the International Security Assistance Force headquarters. The names of the killed in action in the coalition would be read. Sadly, there was almost always at least one American trooper, generally more. Less frequently fatalities from other coalition members. The Afghan military representative always spoke last. He did not read names. He just said a number: 137, 143, 176. The number of Afghan national security forces killed that week. The corruption, yes, a major factor in the difficulties we faced and the Afghans faced in Afghanistan. But you know what? That corruption's been rattling around for a long time. The casualties have been around, sadly, for a long time. Yet the force soldiered on. What changed? Only one variable. We said, we are done. We are going home. And that announcement just pulled the keystone right out of the arch, and the whole structure collapsed.
And removed the air cover that was needed, correct?
Everything. We built an Afghan ground force that was modeled on our own. That was a mistake. It was to be deployed everywhere and to be sustained and supported by air assets, medevacs, resupply, and combat air where necessary. You take that combat air away, the downrange deployments become unsustainable. And of course, when we pulled our troops, we also pulled out our contractors. The Air Force will not function in Afghanistan without those US contractors. We pulled them out too, and we saw, again, the collapse of the whole structure.
And basically that means the planes aren't going to fly, the radars won't work. Take a minute now and tell us about the role of Pakistan, because one moment it's our friend, next minute it's not our enemy.
Well, this takes us back to that strategic patience point. So we have a history in Pakistan that most Americans can't remember, most Pakistanis will never forget. Pakistan was a very close and essential ally during the anti-Soviet jihad, when our trainers on Pakistani soil up in the Northwest frontier with Gulf states money trained thousands of Afghan fighters to take on the Soviets back in their own country. We could not have done that without Pakistan. We needed that terrain and the support of the Pakistani government to make it happen. But when we succeeded, the retreat of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan, we decided we were done. Now, we knew that a vicious civil war in Afghanistan was starting to bubble and brew, because the only thing that kept the Mujahideen factions together was a common enemy, the Soviets. Soviets are gone, then it's a run for the roses. We knew it. It wasn't our problem. Also, when we left, we stopped getting exemptions annually to something called the Pressler Amendment, legislation that requires the total cessation of any economic or security assistance to any country that is embarked on a nuclear weapons program. Well, Pakistan had announced they were, as India had. But we got them those exemptions until we didn't need them anymore. Then we didn't get those exemptions. So the Pakistanis, in their narrative, were left with this civil war right on their unstable borders with no support from the United States. Fast forward to 9/11, we're back. The world has taken another turn and we need Pakistan again. I was there for 3 years as ambassador and kind of got to know how they thought, and they kind of got to know me. And I heard the case they made, reciting that history and then saying, look, we're with you on Al Qaeda. We're working together. Let's nail these guys. But if you think we're going to take on the Afghan Taliban, you're completely crazy. We're not going to turn them into a mortal enemy of ours to make you happy, because you know what? We know what you're going to do. you're going to leave. Two more quick points on that. So in one sense, the Pakistanis felt vindicated. They had told us so. We were leaving and the Taliban was back. I think those high fives probably lasted one morning, because now the Pakistanis have to worry about what happens next to them, because this successful Taliban takeover, lightning takeover of the country of Afghanistan is giving huge jolts of adrenaline to Islamic radicals everywhere, not least in Pakistan, where the Pakistani Taliban is targeting the government of Pakistan. So they are going to face heightened threats to their internal security and stability. And that's our problem too. 220 million people, nuclear weapons that we have now worked to further destabilize.
And certainly India's problem as well. I don't want our program to end without you talking about No One Left Behind, because there's so many agencies and organizations that people can support, and I hope our audience will review those lists. But tell us about the program about No One Left Behind.
Well, it's all in the name, Jim. No One Left Behind, a nonprofit organization formed to bring those who risk their lives on our behalf as interpreters for the military and for others, for the embassies in Iraq and in Afghanistan. That's our mission, get those people out. And it has been a hard struggle even before this latest event in Afghanistan. There is a 14-step process that took at least 3 years for anyone to complete. And in the meantime, we were vulnerable to Taliban threats and killings. We believed that up until this latest collapse that something like 300 had died, assassinated by the Taliban. So now we're doing everything we can to get them out. We've done our own charters. We've worked with the government, the American government, to get as many out as we possibly could. Sadly, that window is closing, and a lot of them will be left behind, sadly. But the need is to support those also who do get out.
And let me be clear, you're not talking just about military interpreters, you're talking about people who worked on civil society, journalists, etc.
Well, there are different categories, and I won't belabor all that here. Special immigrant visas, which is what we're talking about, those who work directly for us, either for the military or for the embassy, have an entitlement to these special visas. There are other programs for some of the other groupies that you mentioned. But this is those who supported us directly and now can pay a fearful price for having done it. They're going to need support when they get to America. We are bringing in an unprecedented number. The resources to support them in the States have always been limited. So we're going to need a lot of help to do the right thing for these individuals and for their families over a period of time. At the end of the day, they will be huge assets to our society. These are brave, hardworking people. They value education. They want the best for their families, and that they will pay back more than we pay for them. But at the beginning, we've got to be able to get the resources to be able to support them when they finally get back to the United States.
Well, given your familiarity with the region, I mean, just phenomenal experience. What you've talked about Pakistan, but what else concerns you the most right now?
Again, it's layered. I think the most critical issue is that Afghans, or that this whole thing in Afghanistan has been a huge boost for militant Islam, if you will, groups like the Taliban, like the Pakistani Taliban, like the Kashmiri groups that Pakistan itself created. I think we're going to see a lot more action from them. I think the region will be increasingly destabilized. I've already mentioned the issue of Pakistan. It's going to be a problem for Iran as well. Iran almost went to war with the Taliban when they controlled Afghanistan in the late 1990s. And those tensions are going to rise again.
As I've often heard you say in your remarks, if you think things are bad today, they may be worse tomorrow. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you, Jim.
And during the last half hour, we've covered a number of points that certainly merit our continued thought. Did we as voters pay sufficient attention to the cost and benefit of our 2-decade-long investment in Afghanistan? And I'll also ask you this. Do you feel that we have a moral obligation to foster freedoms that we as Americans take for granted? You know, the distance between Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport and Hamid Karzai International Airport is about 7,500 miles. That may seem to be a long distance, but given the influx of refugees that are arriving throughout the United States, we're all neighbors. Elected officials often tell me that they don't frequently hear from constituents about foreign policy. That needs to change. Thank you so much for watching. Dennis and I are here bringing different perspectives to you, to people who care about things that matter. I'm Jim Falk. We'll see you very soon. Thanks again for watching.